Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. And today we have a Caro Kann Defense, and my opponent goes for the advanced variation. So if you want to check out the previous episodes of this series, playlist link below, and there'll be another playlist with every single Caro Kann game I have on my channel. So we're going to go c5. This is the second most popular approach after the more popular bishop to f5. Bishop f5 is perfectly fine. I just prefer the c5 move. Some of you may be wondering why I am now returning to this series. I am going to still be doing my tournament game recaps, and I'm also probably going to be ending my League Chess speedrun prematurely, because I think people wanted to see a conclusion to this speedrun, because of course we haven't reached 2000 yet. I got frustrated with cheaters on chess.com. I faced just one too many, really, and I got really frustrated by it. However, let me know what you guys think in the comments about the cheating situation, things that can potentially be done to prevent it being such an issue. I'd really like to know your guys' thoughts on that. But anyway, back to the game. My opponent takes, which is probably the most challenging line, and plays f4. Now, let me think. I'm pretty sure e6 is the better approach here. And my opponent, I expect, will go into the bishop to e3 line, which is a line that until recently I hadn't really grasped for the black pieces. I actually had an online game a couple of days ago in this line where after bishop e3, d5, bishop f2, I think I went for knight to e7. You can also go knight to h6, which I think is probably a bit more accurate, trying to get into either g4 or f5. And the knight can actually do not a little bit, but actually a fair bit of damage if it can jump into the weak dark squares. If white plays something else, like knight to f3, that's just bad, because we'll take on c5. And you might be saying, well, what's the difference between bishop e3, d4, bishop f2, bishop c5? Well, the difference is that if bishop to e3 is played, we have to go d4. We have to go d4. Sorry, we have to win this pawn back, because it's tempo on the bishop, of course, and disconnects the bishop from the pawn. However, by committing our pawn to the d4 square, the pawn overreaches, right? The e-pawn, yeah, this is just a bad move. I'll show you after the game the way that white should approach this position, but you have to go bishop e3 and try to put pressure on this pawn, because I obviously can't put a pawn on c5 to support it, and I obviously can't put a pawn on e5 to support it. In essence, it's an isolated pawn deep in the white territory. However, with knight to f3, I can take on c5, control this very important diagonal, which white will struggle to challenge me on now. And I get everything I want. I get the pawn back. I suppose the only downside is this bishop can't really get out very easily. If I could teleport this bishop to g4, this would be a dream position. But okay, c3 played. Probably a bit unnecessary, but in fairness, it's not clear how white develops. I think knight to h6 is actually the more accurate move here. Because I was speaking to a guy called Luke Honey. If you've been watching my Buka tournament recap, you'll know that he was our board 1. And he also plays the Caro Kann, and he was, I'm pretty sure it was Luke. He was telling me that in these lines where f4 is on the board before you develop your knight, it's better to develop it to h6 rather than e7, because normally, if the pawn is back on f2, my opponent will just take on h6 with the bishop and ruin my pawn structure, right? Okay, b4 is an interesting move. I suppose that's the point of c3. Okay, I'm just going to drop the bishop back. b5, I'm just going to drop the knight back. And these pawns are a bit strange. Okay, interesting. Let me just finish my thoughts on knight to h6 first. The bishop can't take, right? As opposed to going knight to e7, we not only have access to f5, but also g4. So we get another square that we could potentially go to, which could be quite an active square. Also, yeah, our queen is still able to come out on this diagonal if we so desire. So it's just a better way to go about the position, essentially. And we can always revert back to playing it normally with knight to f5, which of course we could do via knight to e7, but it's a bit more flexible. The computer will often evaluate it as exactly the same evaluation, however, this is more flexible. Okay, a4 from my opponent. I don't really want to allow a5, kicking my bishop back to c7, which would probably allow the bishop to come to e3. So I either should play a5 here, forcing the move b4 and dropping the knight back to e7. The knights could come to g4 and f5 potentially, and really go after these dark squares. Alternatively, I could play the move a6. However, b5, take looks decent for white. Also a6, a5, bishop back, b5 looks good as well. Maybe? I think I just prefer the move a5. Now, taking would not be a good option. Mostly because you'll be splitting up your queenside pawns, which are probably going to be pretty tender. Yeah, okay, so he pushes. Let's drop our knight back to e7. That's also another benefit of putting the knight on h6 rather than e7, because if this knight, in this position, if this knight was on e7, we'd have to put our other knight back to b8. Obviously, this is a far better version. Okay, h3. Obviously trying to stop knight to g4, and I do not blame him for being concerned about the f2 square. We could hop our knight into f5, trying to come into g3. That looks really good. We could do it with this knight. However, this knight can come to g6 if we want. And it also supports the d5 pawn, making a move like c4 less scary. So I prefer to move this knight. I don't know whether the computer will agree or disagree with me, but we will see. We also dominate the e3 square, like I mentioned earlier, which is, you know, just good. Obviously, that's good. G3 is weak because the f-pawn has been pushed and the h-pawn has been pushed. In the future, if this knight moves, then the h4 square could be very vulnerable. There may even be times where we might move this knight and then put this, or even that knight on h4. That looks pretty tempting, offering a trade, which would, of course, lead to probably checkmate if our queen can get to the h4 square. Queen d3. Okay, I don't really know what that move does. Probably trying to defend the e3 square. We could play knight to g3, which I think we should play, because then we can probably whack the knight on e4. We could put the other knight on f5 and just, yeah, we could just leave our knight there. It's constantly looking at the bishop anyway. That looks really fun. I'm going to play that. Bring the knight in. Attack the rook. Ooh, rook h2. That is a sad move. Oh, yeah, we cover the g1 square. We could just play bishop. Oh, no, we can't. The knight covers that. Yeah, I completely forgot that he can't go rook to g1. But, okay, we could bring our other knight in. That looks like it makes a lot of sense. We could castle, but, like, knight g5 is a bit, you know... I don't really want to deal with that. So let's hop in knight e to f5. There's no good way for white to kick my knights out. No good way. And they're just causing a bit of chaos because it's important to make sure we do have a knight on the f5 square because we want to prevent the move bishop to e3 going for trades. Okay, knight to a3. I assume trying to play the move c4, which would make sense. We could castle here. Is there anything else? We could take the bishop, but I don't know what that really does. This bishop isn't going anywhere. It can only go to e2, where it would still be hanging anyway. So I'm in no rush to take that. We could try and solve the problem of our light squared bishop. A move like bishop to d7, trying to go rook to c8, but c4 looks a little bit annoying. I think castling might be a good option. I'm going to castle. I'm now not really concerned about knight to g5 because this diagonal is blocked off by our knight. Okay, knight c2 is not something I was expecting. He's, I assume, really trying to fight for the e3 square. Maybe trying to put this bishop on a3, but I doubt it. I don't think that's the idea. We could go for a move like queen c7, trying to put pressure on the c file. Again, this bishop really does suck. It is not a good bishop, but it's not the end of the world. We could play a move like f6, but white just does nothing, and taking only helps white. So I don't really want to do that. Bishop d7, I think we probably just play moves like queen e7, rook, well, maybe rook fd8 and rook a to c8. That looks good. We have positional dominance. We're absolutely dominating positionally. There's even ideas to like lift a rook to c4 and try and get it to the e4 square. That would be actually pretty reasonable. Again, I know we can take the bishop, but I don't think there's a good follow-up. There may actually be No, forget what I'm saying. Forget what I'm saying. We could try and go like queen c7, queen c5, but like that feels like a short-sighted plan. I'd rather play things a little bit slower and really try and massage the position. My opponent may try and go for c4. In fact, I think that's probably his best bet. However, opening up the C file and the D file like that, I think we're in a much better position to take advantage of it than our opponent. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it, and hopefully you guys do enjoy the return of the chess.com educational speedrun series. Yeah, I mean, this bishop is just the only real problem in our position, which is sometimes just what happens in the Caro. Okay, my opponent opts for putting the knight on a d4, supported by this knight, of course. I don't really want to take this. The pawn takes, clogs everything up. I don't want to allow that. If take, it's all right. I could actually play queen to h4 here, taking advantage of the fact the knight is no longer looking at that square. If knight takes f5 comes with check, and that should be winning. If queen to h4, if the knight returns to f3 to try and kick my queen away, which may be semi-forced. Do I have a good move there? I could just go queen e7 and essentially say my opponent's lost a move, right? Because he just moved his knight back and forth, and I've put my queen on e7, which is a better square than d8. So I think I like that. Let's play it. Queen h4. That's a neat little trick, I think. Because, yeah, I mean, white has to kick my queen away. I think he has to kick my queen away. If he doesn't, the game is probably over. Wow. Wow, okay. So he moves the king. Again, I could take this bishop, but I don't think it's particularly necessary. I'm more tempted to just go rook c8, because then taking the bishop, queen takes, I'll have rook c3, which is actually a threat. So I'm just going to go for that, rook a c8. And again, if you want to drop your knight back to f3, that's fine. I'll drop my queen back to e7. If you want to take my knight, I'll take back, yeah, with the knight, and continue our control of the e3 square. I think. I suppose that takes pressure off the bishop, though. Okay, knight e3. Interesting. Take. The queen can't take because then you no longer defend the bishop, so bishop has to take. Then we can take on f1, the queen has to take, and then we can take on c3 with an attack on the bishop and pressure on the knight. That looks pretty good. We shouldn't take here first because I think the knight can take. So that doesn't quite work as well. Sorry, I'm just thinking 1 second whether we can exploit this bishop somehow, but I don't think we can. Let's take on e3. Queen take again is met with knight to f1, so the bishop takes. Now we can take on f1, I believe. In fairness, you could consider the move knight to e4, targeting the c3 pawn. We should probably consider that, actually. Knight e4 not only targets c3, so bishop d2 defending can be met with knight to f2 check, picking up the queen. So if a move like rook c1 defending, do we have a threat? I don't think so. I don't think so. No. No, we should take. Worth checking that, though. Worth checking. Now, of course, the queen has to take, and the c3 pawn falls. And then we are ready to double up. My bishop on d7 still sucks, admittedly. Oh, have I blundered this? With a discovered attack on the bishop? Oh, I always have queen to d8, which helps. And a move like knight to e2 can't be played hitting my rook, because my rook will take the bishop. That is admittedly kind of lucky. Knight f3. I think I probably am forced to play queen to d8. I don't think I have another option. So yeah, that is a little bit of a fluke, to be fair. Yeah, and I don't have any checks because the knight blocks this checking path. And it'd be g4 anyway with a counter-attack. So, okay. We emerge a pawn up with the bishop pair. However, this bishop is not very impressive, so I could hardly call it a good bishop pair. We're preparing rook after c8. This rook is kind of useless unless my opponent moves the g-pawn to try and get it involved to a square like d2. The king is very weak, my king is very safe. I suppose although my bishop's terrible on d7, it does discourage the move f5, which would be white's main pawn break to try and start an attack on my king. So although it is a bad bishop, I'm not arguing it's a good bishop, it does serve some kind of function. Okay, g3. Attacking the queen. Let me think. I think queen d8 actually makes the most sense. Just to make sure this bishop is defended. I'm going to play it. I think it's a safe move. The bishop is still hanging. And the knight is also hanging. You know, a move like bishop d2, I think we can just go ahead and take the knight. Bishop takes, rook c1, not even bishop b4, but d4 actually, locking the bishop in place. And then this bishop could get back into the game via like c8, pawn b6, and bishop b7. Maybe. But with a passed pawn protected by the bishop, the king stranded in the center, and obviously we'd have a bishop pair for a rook and a pawn up. That should be, you know, pretty much lights out. Again, f5 would be difficult to play in that line because my bishop actually performs quite a good defensive duty. Although I'd rather it be, you know, on a square like e4, where it would be much more active and perform that function. So, okay, we'll see what my opponent goes for. I mean, there's not that many options. Well, no, there's a lot of options, but it doesn't seem to be many good options. Because his pieces are just a little bit tangled up. They don't coordinate very well. Really, any of them. They're not working together. I mean, whilst it's only three of my pieces, I'd argue, are working together towards a specific goal. If this rook can get itself to c8, it'll also be helping out. And maybe I have to leave this bishop behind simply because I can't get it involved in the game yet. But if four of my pieces are working together, you know, that's still quite a sizable bunch. Okay. Of course, we could take, and win a pawn. That's one option. However, that's an opposite coloured bishop position. And although we will be up 2 pawns there, I'd rather not have an opposite coloured bishop position. So the second move that comes to mind is queen to c7. Just giving my rook some more support, preparing rook f to c8. What else? What else? Queen c7 seems like the best move. f6 I don't think makes any sense. We're weakening our position for absolutely no reason. So let's go queen c7. This is defended, this is defended. Everything is defended. So tactics should never really work against us here. And we're just preparing a very simple plan of rook f to c8, which simplicity is probably the way to go here, considering we're up a pawn. So if everything were traded off, we should win the endgame. A passed d-pawn is going to be a big asset, because it's a protected passed pawn as well. Also, we dominate the only open file on the board. We have a very strong bishop. We're invading on the third rank. My opponent's king is very weak. My king is very safe. It's just a culmination of things going in our favor, which should lead to a dominant position. But of course, we have to prove that. We still have to prove that. See what my opponent does. It's not clear. Maybe he should try and run his king to the king side. Although, you know, then he could get hit with tactics like bishop takes, and rook to c2 with a skewer. So he's still got to be very careful. Like I was saying, I don't want to trade the bishop for the knight to get an opposite colored bishop endgame, but if it means I just win on the spot, then of course I'll do that. Okay. f5 was probably going to come at some point, but I didn't think it'd be coming yet. Queen takes e5 looks like a bit of a problem, because this is hanging, and this is hanging, and we have a pin. Well, not a pin, but like, we can see the queen through the bishop. And I suppose g3 also hangs. If you take, I can just take with the bishop, or even the pawn. That's fine. Maybe even want to open up the f-file. We just have to make sure, because if my queen takes here, none of these pieces are defended by each other anymore. So we have to make sure there's no tactics going against us. However, I don't think there is, because this bishop hangs in every single line, and my queen can always evacuate by taking. There might also be tactics on this rook, you know, through the knight and my rook. So taking on e5 should be absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. Which I suppose was another benefit of queen to c7, which I didn't really consider, but the c7 square is just more active than the d8 square, so things are more likely to work out in my favor by having more active pieces. You don't have to calculate absolutely everything and every possibility in a chess game. If you position your pieces in a way that looks and feels logical and active, more than likely things will work out the way that you would like them to. That's not gospel, but like, you know, that is often how it goes. Okay. How is our opponent going to deal with this? I don't think there's really a way. I don't think there's really a way. There are going to be lines where I can just take on e3 and then take on d4. There's going to be lines where I can just take on d4 and take back on d4. I may, at the very least, just win f5 or maybe g3. If my opponent like moves his bishop, then I can just take on d4. Knight. Okay, that's an exotic move. Hits my queen, sure. And my bishop is also hit, but like I said before, my queen can always move with a capture. So I can just take on e3. And this knight looks really cool, I suppose, because it's being hit by loads of different things at once. And it can go to e7 with check, but it doesn't do anything afterwards. It doesn't hit anything important. There's no kind of checkmate threat or anything. We're offering a queen trade, of course. We're also threatening other mating ideas. I think taking here with the rook. No, maybe the bishop. No, I'm going to take with the bishop, because I want to play the move d4 and lock my bishop in. make sure my opponent can't access the C file. And if my opponent takes, probably take with the bishop, just to get my bishop out. And then our extra piece should be felt pretty nicely. Let's go d4, support the bishop. I know I could have taken on f5, but things just feel a little bit loose. Knight takes d5 probably gets my opponent back into the game. Check here. I suppose I could win back the piece, but unnecessary. Unnecessary. I just want to be nice and simple. I want my opponent to take me so I can get my bishop out and very, very active. I like the move d4 because it shuts down the d file, keeps the e file shut, and allows nothing on the c file. Also stops rook to f2, so hard to make anything happen on the f file. Just trying to really squeeze my opponent's position and make it so that he doesn't have anything. I suppose I maybe could have considered the move bishop to g5 there, targeting the knight. To be fair, that might have just won the knight, so I probably should have considered that, but I mean d4 is perfectly reasonable. And I don't think this move is really going anywhere, because it's going to be hard for this knight to get out. The best bet is probably takes g4 to give himself the f5 square. But we'll see what he does. To be honest, it might make more sense to take with the f-pawn, so that I open up the f-file for my rook. Oh, okay, he does it this way. Right, that makes sense. Let's go bishop g5, attack the knight. But if takes... pawn takes probably makes more sense, because we maintain control of the f5 and d5 squares with a pawn rather than the bishop, and we open up the f-file, which probably forces a rook trade if we want it. See what my opponent does. Kind of awaiting a resignation, but it'll be interesting to go over this in the computer analysis. Okay, that's a free knight, thank you. Because in the opening, as I said before, knight to f3 is not a good move. Bishop to e3 is kind of the accepted move in this position. And if black doesn't go d4, it's a very miserable game. But I'll show you some of the theory of that line after the game finishes in the analysis. Okay. What's my opponent going to do? I don't know. He's down 2 bishops and 2 pawns. And I mean, there's not really anything here. I'm probably just going to push this pawn and get it to e7. I suppose the upside for him is my bishop still sucks. This bishop spent the whole game doing absolutely nothing. Okay, that's a move. Here, take. This is annoying. It's a bit annoying. I'm going to take on h3 to threaten rook to h1. So if you want to take here, then I'll just go rook h1. I'll win your rook, you can get my bishop, that's fine. My bishop sucks anyway. Okay. Let's go d3 with check. King will have to run this way, because if it steps onto the back rank, I'll deliver a check. Okay, yes, my opponent resigns. I suppose I could have also gone for rook to e3 check here, but d3 check, perfectly reasonable, and a very, very solid game. Like I said, this approach from my opponent in the opening with knight to f3, not it. Not it. So let's jump into the analysis, and I'll show you not only the game itself, but the way that the opening tends to be handled. Okay, so not a perfect game, but a pretty good game. There was a couple points where I think a lot of you would have been very skeptical as to why I didn't play a certain move, but we will cover those moves. So e4, c6, d4, d5, right? The Caro Kann. My opponent goes for the advanced variation, and we go c5. The vast majority of people play this, which is just bad. It's just bad. I personally call it a trap, like a positional trap almost. If you check out my Caro Kann playlist and many of the previous episodes of this speedrun, you'll see those games. I think one of them is called something like Everyone Falls for This Caro Kann Trap. And that is this trap. I consider it to be so. Anyway, my opponent takes on c5, which is typically considered to be the more like difficult approach for black to handle. Knight c6 is very common, going after the pawn. Most people play knight to f3 here, and then like bishop g4, maybe bishop to b5, maybe c3. There's a lot of different options, but the idea is that black will most likely win back one of these pawns, if not both, maybe. But dc5, knight c6, my opponent goes f4, and f4 is probably one of the more testing lines, because black has to go e6 and try to win the pawn back. Black doesn't have time for a move like bishop to f5, because white will put the knight on f3, and now if we go e6, bishop e3, we can't play the move d4, because it's controlled, 1, 2, 3 times by white, and we only control it twice, so we can't win our pawn back. Therefore, we have to start with e6. Yes, it blocks in our bishop, but it's just necessary. And if white plays any other move, like our opponent did in the game, played knight to f3, black is better. Slightly. Because black wins back this pawn. And yes, you know, our bishop on c8 does suck. There were ways that I could have gotten it out a bit better during the game. But this is a very comfortable position for black, mostly because of the weakness of these sorts of squares around the center and the king side that are very easily exploitable, as we saw. Bishop e3 is kind of the way that white needs to play this. Now, before I quite understood the Caro Kann as well as I do now, I once played this in an over-the-board game. This is just bad. It's just bad. I think my opponent maybe played a3? Ah, yeah, this was it. And here I'm supposed to play g5 to try and undermine the defense of the e-pawn. I, of course, didn't see that. I think I actually played knight g6, which is just a bad move. And my opponent continued developing, played the move b4, and I got slaughtered on the queen side down a pawn. So the way you have to play it is to play d4, kick the bishop back, take on c5, and white can try to win the pawn with moves like knight to f3. We probably are going to play knight to h6 to get into f5 or g4. There's moves like c3 here, which are quite interesting. You can't take because the bishop hangs, and you can get very creative with the positions here. Now taking is a move. Queen d8 here. And if this, then this. And the bishop can't come here because I'll take it. So it's interesting stuff. But my opponent goes knight to f3. We take on c5, and we just have a very comfortable position. I mean, if this bishop could transport to g4, I'd say we're almost winning. But c3 from my opponent, I understand you want to take control of d4, but I don't want to put my pawn on d4, because as we saw in this line, this pawn is just overextended in a lot of cases. If this knight can make it to the b3 square, for example, we could be under some serious pressure, and it could be very difficult to defend the pawn. A lot of the time, you have to counterattack like the f4 or b2 pawn. But c3, okay, I mean, development should be the... I was expecting bishop d3, for example, which looks very natural. But in fairness, you can't castle. So I don't blame my opponent for going for this plan of bishop to e3. Maybe it was better to do it with bishop d3, queen e2, and bishop to e3, though. But who knows? c3, not a terrible move. We go knight to h6. As I explained during the game, knight h6 is superior to knight to e7. Again, if you forgot the reasons, go back earlier in the video. I explained them very nicely. And then my opponent plays b4, which, I mean, I get it, but you can't be overextending like this. There's really no need. So a4 is a challenging move. And to be fair, my move was not the best, a5. So I rejected the move a6 because I thought after a5, bishop a7, my opponent can play b5. And I thought this was a little bit uncomfortable. However, the way the computer justifies this is one with bishop c5, claiming that the a-pawn is weak, which it is. And secondly, with the move bishop to d7, essentially being like, Yeah, the bishop is trapped behind the e-pawn. However, if we can bait this bishop to the b5 square, then we can try and secure either a bishop trade or give the light-squared bishop a way out of its little prison, right? However, the way I handled the position with allowing b5 and knight e7, this knight can never really get out because my pawn is on a5, meaning I can't play pawn a6 to challenge the b5 pawn. And obviously, as we saw, it didn't end up making all that much difference in the game, but it's, you know, a useful positional concept to understand. So we drop the knight back to e7. We're still better. h3 is a wild, like, misjudgment of the position. You have to develop. You have to develop. And you're kind of taking away the f5 square, although I do control it twice. Knight ef5 is the best move here. And again, I'm just trying to clamp down on the e3 square, because if bishop e3 can't be played, not only does my bishop remain very strong, but white can't castle. I don't know how the computer claims this is almost equal. I think the plan is to play c4, which is what I was expecting. But h3, I mean, it doesn't matter all that much if I put a knight there. Like, if bishop d3, knight here, there's knight d4 just blocking my bishop's scope, and my knight is just vulnerable. I have to drop it back, and I'm wasting a lot of time. So h3, though. Knight h to f5, trying to get into the dark squares. Queen d3, trying to take the e3 square away from me. But knight g3, putting pressure on. Rook h2 has to be played to save the rook. Knight e to f5 is a perfectly reasonable move, just, you know, securing the knight, securing the e3 square. Knight to a3. I was expecting c4 at some point. The computer doesn't love it, but I think this is probably the best way for white to try and fight back. Because, like, let's say I take, you can see the evaluation drop. I mean, I'm still better, but white can try and fight here. He can try and fight. I suppose I secure this diagonal for my bishop now, but, like, with the queens off the board, that probably benefits the white pieces because his king is so weak. But knight g3, rook h2, knight ef5, knight a3. Obviously, we learned that the knight was going to c2. I thought it was to support the c4 pawn push. Here we just castle, knight c2, bishop d7, knight f to d4, and here I play queen to h4. Now, the computer wants knight to e4, an idea that I spotted later in the game, which I suppose frees up this diagonal for queen h4 to come with tempo on the king. So after knight takes f5, okay, the computer wants to throw this in. If the king steps here, bishop g1. And if king e2, now ef5. And if the queen takes on d5, we have another fork. Unnecessarily complicated. I liked my idea of queen h4 because I thought that white had to return to f3, which he did. And here I was going to play queen to e7 because I wanted to put my queen on e7 anyway. And we essentially have the same position as we did here, except my queen is already on e7, right? It would be the same position, but I'm a tempo ahead, essentially. My opponent goes king d1, though. Rook a to c8. The computer likes knight to e4. It likes knight takes f1, but I thought rook a to c8 made a lot of sense. Knight e3 is not a good move, though. And I took on e3, which isn't actually the best. Better was taking on d4. And after cd4, queen f4... This feels risky. However, if this knight ever moves, like this, let's say, I can take it on f1, supported by my knight, and the knight no longer defends the bishop. So there's technically no risk, but I liked this plan of taking on f1 and taking on c3. Now, there is a stronger move for black here. Pause the video, try and find the best move. I probably should have seen this. It's queen g3, and the point is that basically everything is under attack. I don't have to cash in just yet. If you're going to save the rook, then I would just take on e3 and the threats pile up. But, okay, I decided to go for this. Rook takes c3. And after g3, I actually don't know why I didn't take that. That's just a free pawn. And white is completely lost. But for some reason, I didn't take it. I dropped my queen back to d8, which is still fine, but not as accurate. Queen e2. We go queen c7, which is the best move. And my plan was, let's say my opponent plays a move like bishop g1, just to go rook c8 and just triple up. Now this is potentially a threat as well, because if white plays like a nothing move, this is just mate. So, you know, good position, and that was the plan. My opponent went f5 though, which makes sense, but we just take on e5. There's no kinds of tactics, because we just take the bishop, knight check, king moves, we secure the queen trade. Here bishop g5 would have been more accurate, but technically doesn't matter. And this is a relatively easy cleanup. d3, king to f2, bishop f6. Yeah, okay, that's pretty nice. And a very clean game. The Caro Kann strikes again. If you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. And if you want to see another really interesting Caro Kann game, then check out the video up here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those.